In today's video, I'm going to be explaining exactly how you read and understand all the information that's on the outside of your paint tube or your pan paints. Welcome back to my channel. On this channel, you'll find all things watercolor, as well as lots of drawing videos, mixed media, even some business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's free, and if you click the little bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. Make at least one free video a week here on YouTube. So in my many years working as a professional watercolor artist, I have had quite an affinity to color. I've worked with two different manufacturers to design my own paint colors and also to design things like color mixing charts. And as the years go on, I learn more and more about paint pigments and the properties of watercolor paints. However, the disclaimer here is that I don't consider myself to be an expert. I'm not sure any artist is, although there are some very good artists on the internet who you'll find have a lot of resources that you can look at. But what I'm trying to say is the subject here is so vast. Sometimes when I talk about things on YouTube, I talk about a certain aspect of a thing and I say, well, really that's a whole other video to let you know that that subject could be expanded upon. But when it comes to things like paint pigments and all of the other things that we're going to talk about in this video, it's not just another video, it's a whole Netflix series. In fact, it's multiple Netflix series. I could actually take a single mineral paint pigment, I could go to a documentary filmmaker and I could say, can you produce me a 2-hour documentary just on this one pigment, just on the sources, the manufacture, the history, and I assure you they would have no trouble at all filling that 2 hours. So what I'm giving you today is a broad overview. Now I'm going to be showing you and talking about tubes of paint. The first thing we're going to look at is sizing, and I will be discussing pan paints then. But thereafter, everything else really is the same. You just might find the information in a different place because a pan is smaller than a tube, so they're not going to print quite as much on there. I want you also to understand that there's no sort of overall worldwide standard that tells manufacturers that they have to be sort of completely truthful on their paint tubes, or that they have to name things a certain way. Some of them use certain measuring standards and certain governing bodies, but they do vary across the world. What I'm saying is there's very little consistency here, particularly in the naming of paint colours. We're going to talk about this in much more depth in a moment. But do understand that this video should be a starting point for you. It should help you to understand the basics. And thereafter, you'll need to go and research. You've got Google, you've got Wikipedia, you've got lots of artists and lots of manufacturers putting all sorts of information out there. And the manufacturer's website of your paint should be the first place that you look. So whether you're more interested in paint pigments, whether you're interested in the binders, the transparency, the granulation, whatever it is, you need to do more research, and you also need to make your own swatches because these are going to tell you everything you need to know. However, I'm going to give you a lot of information in this video. I think you're going to find it really, really interesting. So let's jump in. The first thing that we need to look at, we're going to look at the manufacturer's name and also the size, the amount of paint that you're getting when you buy your tube or your pan. So manufacturer is fairly easy. The manufacturer is usually written on the tube. However, there is something to watch out for, and that is what they call a range. So within each manufacturer, they may have more than one range. We're going to talk later on about the difference between artists' quality ranges and students' quality ranges. But first of all, let's just look at the manufacturer's name. This one's pretty clear. It's by Jackman's Art Materials. I work with this manufacturer for full disclosure. This one here, we've got Winsor & Newton. Now this one here, you might think this was made by Rembrandt, not himself obviously, but actually Rembrandt is the range. The manufacturer of this one is Talens. They are a Dutch brand, very good quality. So if you're not sure who actually makes your paints, Google is your friend. Let's talk now about sizes. Now everything I tell you in this video about manufacturers and sizing and such like is a generalization because there are hundreds, possibly thousands of brands across the world, and some of the brands in the Far East don't follow the exact same rules as European and American brands. So these are generalizations, but generally speaking, your size range for tubes will go from something like a 5mm tube here up to a 20mm tube. Pan paints, sometimes called blocks or cakes, will come in two sizes generally. This size here is called half pan, and then you get full pan, which is double the size. Now these are made to fit into standard watercolor paint pans. You can buy empty tins and fill in with your own colors. Again, generally speaking, but not always, generally speaking, if your paint is not in a half pan or a full pan, it could be a poor quality paint. If you've got something that's got circular pans, for example, it's very likely to be a cheap or drugstore paint. As I said, don't come after me in the comments. There are one or two brands in the Far East that do use unusual shapes. But generally speaking, this is how you tell you have a quality brand, because they come in full or half pans. If you buy them individually, they'll come in little wrappers like this. You can see there's a lot of information on this wrapper, similar to the information you may get on a paint tube. But you'll also find that with most brands, you can sort of have a look, pull them out, and you've got either a colour name or a colour number on the side. So a question that's frequently asked, so frequent that I saw in my own Facebook group this morning, is how does the size of this relate to this? In other words, how much is in here compared to a tube? Well, I asked a manufacturer, and the answer, like everything in life, is not straightforward. Now, the reason for that is that when you put paint in a pan like this, the manufacturer will formulate it with less binder, and it will also shrink. So some of them will fill halfway and then allow them to shrink and then fill to the top. Because we're dealing oftentimes with natural pigments, you'll get different amounts of shrinkage. You'll get different amounts of shrinkage compared to how much binder you put in. And imagine if you're a paint manufacturer and you pour all your pans of paint and one particular pigment shrinks more than the rest. You're not going to put them out like that with one half full. However, if you want a rough, and I mean a very rough comparison, then the amount that you get in here is similar to a 5mm tube. Now, if you pour a 5mm tube into a pan, it will overflow. So you might think to yourself, well, there's less paint in here, surely. There may be less paint, but there's the same amount of pigment. So in other words, in a tube paint like this, you'll get more binder. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the way it's formulated, it's for using from the tube. With this, you'll get more pigment and less binder. The amount of pigment you're getting is roughly equivalent in a half pan to a 5mm tube, and therefore in a full pan to a 10mm tube. But with the disclaimer, as I said, that you cannot make a direct comparison. Can I pop in briefly and ask if you have pressed the like button, the thumbs up for me, if you are getting some value from this video, if it's useful to you. Please do press that like button for me. If you can like, share, subscribe, which is free, or leave me a comment, all helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Videos like this take many, many hours and days to make. I've just passed 100,000 subscribers. I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. Let's talk about price, how it relates to quality, and how you can tell from your paint tube what sort of quality of paint that you are getting. I mean, you may have to do more research on this one, but we can certainly get some clues. So let's talk about price and how it pertains to quality. Now, you have 3 levels of quality when you buy a tube of paint. You have the artist or professional level. These are formulated with the top quality pigments that the manufacturer can find. They're the highest quality that you can get. Below that, you have students' quality. These are still good paints, but some of the more expensive pigments may have been replaced with slightly cheaper ones, or they may have a little more binder in. Finally, you have cheap paints. I'm talking about stuff that you might find in a stationery shop or a drugstore. Now, these 3 levels of paints are not equally spaced. The student's quality are very close to the artist's quality. In some cases, the paints may be as good. For example, some of the cheaper pigments, the earth pigments, would be a good example of that. Maybe just as good quality as their artist range, but some of the more expensive pigments may have been replaced. So don't dismiss students' quality paints. If you have a range of them, I suggest that you just swatch them, see what you like, and see if there's 1 or 2 that aren't performing as well as you'd like. You can always swap those in. All brands are interchangeable, no matter what the manufacturer would like to tell you. So do all ranges have both a student and an artist quality range? No, they don't. Here we have Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith only do artist quality paints. Here we have Talens Rembrandt. Talens Rembrandt is the artist or professional quality paint made by Talens. Talens have another range, a student's range called Van Gogh. I don't know what Van Gogh did to deserve that, but that's the way it is. Jackman's Art Materials here in the UK, who I work with, they only have an artist range. Winsor & Newton. Now, Winsor & Newton, this one has professional written on it. That tells me that this is their artist or professional range. Winsor & Newton have a student's range called Cotman. One of my least favourite students' ranges, actually, although the artist quality are excellent. Now here we have a Russian brand. This is White Knights by St. Petersburg. These only have one range. It's widely thought of to be a student's range, but actually it punches well above its weight. If you're on a budget, I do suggest these paints. Now, how can you tell if the paint that you're looking to buy is an artist range or a student's range without going on to Google? One of the biggest indicators is price. Now, in a student's quality range, every single colour will be the same price. However, in an artist quality range, it's highly likely that you will see a 3-tier pricing system. This is generally indicated by a series number, Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. Series 1 is usually the most expensive pigments. Series 2 would be the mid-range pigments. And then Series 3 would be your cheaper pigments, earth pigments and such like. If we look at this Rembrandt colour here, I can see that it's Series 3. but it's not always written on the tube. Sometimes you'll need to look on a sort of guide on the website, or it may be on a piece of paper next to the display of paints in an art shop to see with the series numbers and to see what the prices relate to. Now, what's in a name when it comes to paints? Quite a lot. We're going to talk about the names of paints now, and buckle up because there's a lot to cover. So let's look at paint names and what you can glean from them. Now, the name that's on your tube of paint, I want you to consider it as a clue to what's inside, not an exact guide. The reason for this is there's no law worldwide that says that manufacturers have to be truthful or even accurate about what they write on their paint labels. I've done a whole video about how some of the cheaper manufacturers will label phthalo green as Viridian, because Viridian is actually a very expensive pigment, so they replace it with phthalo green. You'll also find that colours from years ago may have been reformulated. For example, Indian yellow used to be made from cow's urine, but no longer is. Ultramarine blue used to be made from purest lapis lazuli. It's now mostly synthetic. You have really three types of name. You have descriptive names, you have common mixed pigment names, and then you have more flowery names. So what do I mean? Here we've got cadmium red, so we can see a little bit about the science of how this red is made. Another one that's quite sciencey, I have chrome oxide green. This is telling us how this green pigment is made. Next, I have commonly used names. So here we have green gold from Daniel Smith. Now, green gold is a common colour across most ranges, as is Payne's grey, but that doesn't mean they're the same pigments because these are mixed pigment colours. So we've got more than one pigment in both of these tubes, and each manufacturer has their own version. So green gold is, as it sounds, a greenish gold, and Payne's grey is a bluish grey, named after the man who invented it. But that doesn't mean that every manufacturer uses the same recipe. They may use completely different recipes. So green gold in Daniel Smith will not be the same as green gold in Winsor and Newton. Now, whilst we're talking about names, let's talk about synthetic paints. So synthetic paints exist and there's nothing wrong with them. They're often very bright, transparent colours. There are certain names that will indicate that your paint is a synthetic colour. Four of the most common ones are phthalocyanine, often shortened to phthalo, quinacridone, sometimes shortened just to quin on the tube if they haven't got much room, diarylide, and azo. Let's talk about some other words you may see on your paint tubes and what they mean. You may see the word permanent on your tube. This generally indicates a colour that has been reformulated from a colour that was previously fugitive or fading. We'll talk more about that later. You may see the word transparent on the tube. Although this does indicate that the paint is a transparent colour, it's not the same as a transparency rating, which again we'll talk about later. You may see the word hue on your tube. Now, hue just means colour. So why would somebody put the word hue after a paint colour? And what does it mean? So I like to explain it in terms of chocolate. So imagine you have chocolate and then you have something called chocolate flavouring. Now, obviously it's not the same as chocolate. Is it worse? Some people would say so. But I'm vegan, I don't want to eat real chocolate. Maybe I have a dairy allergy. Again, I don't want real chocolate, I want chocolate flavouring. So although it can indicate a lower quality, it doesn't necessarily do so. So basically when you see the word hue after a paint colour, what you're getting is you're not getting that colour, you're getting something that mimics that colour. Again, don't always assume this is bad. Now, it may indicate that this is a cheaper quality paint and the manufacturer does not want to shell out for the expensive pigment. But there are also lots of other reasons why you might have a paint that has the word hue on. It may be because the pigment is no longer available. It may be because the pigment has been discovered to be fugitive or fading. It may be that the pigment has been discovered to be toxic. And so there are many, many reasons why you may see the word hue on a paint tube. But remember that what it means is that you are not getting that genuine colour. You are getting a replacement for that colour, something that looks like that colour. But please don't think that that's always a bad thing. You need to do a little bit more investigation to find out exactly why the colour has been replaced, and there may be a very good reason for it. Other indications you may see on a paint tube, you may see the words raw or burnt, especially with the earth pigments. You may see raw umber, you may see burnt umber. These colours look completely different. So burnt and raw is an indication of whether or not the pigment has been heated. It's telling you how the pigment was prepared. Finally, you may see green shade or red shade. This may be brought down to initials like this one here, GS green shade. So I've got phthalo blue, phthalocyanine blue, green shade. So what does this mean? Now, somebody had a huge argument in the comments with me once about the word shade. Now, if you look up the dictionary definition of the word shade, it talks about levels of lightness and darkness. However, this is not how the manufacturers use it, and I am just the messenger, so don't shoot the messenger. When you see green shade or red shade, it indicates which end of the spectrum this version of phthalo blue, you often see it with ultramarine, the version of ultramarine heads towards. Now, if you swatch a green shade ultramarine and a red shade ultramarine, don't expect one to look green and the other to look red. We're talking about tiny, tiny differences here. The red shade ultramarine will head slightly towards the red end of the spectrum, so slightly towards purple, and the green shade ultramarine will be a bit less purple. So these are very small movements in hue, in colour, and it's usually used when the manufacturer has more than one version. So I would expect a phthalo blue green shade to be a little bit more turquoise, and a phthalo blue red shade to be a little bit more towards the purple red end of the spectrum. Now, names, as we have discovered, can give us some clues, but they can also mean pretty much absolutely anything. There's more clarity to be found in pigment numbers. There's also a lot of misinformation about these. Let me explain how they work and clear up some of the things that people get wrong. Let's talk pigment numbers. Now, most tubes of paint will have the pigment number written on the back, and it will be indicated by the letter P with some letters after it. So let me show you what we have here. So if I look on the back of this one here, which is diarylide yellow, I have PY83. PY stands for pigment yellow. 83 is its place on the colour index chart. You may also see the letter CI. You may even see separate numbers with the letters CI. This is colour index. It's left over from the dye industry. It's just a different way of categorising colours. You needn't worry about it too much. Now, there aren't too many of these P categories. We also have PW, which is pigment white. We have PV, pigment violet, PR, pigment red, PG, pigment green. We have PO, pigment orange. I think I'm getting them all here. Now, the only slight variation in this system, which is pretty easy to remember, is when we come to PB, because although pigment blue is easy to remember, B also stands for brown and black. So these colours are written like this: P, B and a small r for brown, and P, B and a small k for black. You may sometimes see a decimal point after a number and another number. This is just a further difference between the type of pigments, a further categorization. So let's talk about what people get wrong about pigment numbers. Now, what people get wrong about pigment numbers is assuming that because you have the same pigment number, you have the same color. Now, you have the same pigment, but you don't necessarily have the same color. Now, the reason for this is there's huge variation to be found in the type of pigments and the preparation of the pigments. I like to explain it in terms of diamonds because diamonds are all the same chemical composition. But if I told you that every single diamond that was found or cut was identical, you'd think I was crazy. So what can affect the way a pigment looks? First of all, we have the quality of the pigment. We may have the country that it comes from. There may be a difference to be found there. Different manufacturers may prepare pigments in different ways. And then we have grind size. Now, grind size is important. It talks about the size which the pigment is ground down to. In other words, how large or small the little granules of pigment are. Why on earth would this affect colour? Well, colour is simply the way that our eyes interpret light bouncing off of a surface, and the texture of that surface will affect the colour that we see. Therefore, if a pigment is ground to different sizes, you will see slight variations in colour. So it really makes me laugh when I go onto Facebook groups and I see people saying, well, I've got this pigment and this pigment. If I mix them together, I've got the same pigments as this Daniel Smith paint. Well, I'm afraid it's not that simple. Another thing to consider is the buying power of large manufacturers. Many rare pigments come onto the market and they're only available in very large quantities, many hundreds of kilos. And this is something to remember if you're buying pigments off of a tiny Etsy seller who's making them in her kitchen. You may think, oh, how lovely. They're so bespoke and they're so individual and they're so high quality. And I'm not saying anything bad about those paints at all. It's always fun to try new paints, but something to consider is that some of the very best pigments in the world are probably only available to manufacturers who have quite a large buying power. Now, apart from pigment, our paints contain binders. So what can we tell from the paint tube about what binders are used? Often very little, but let's have a brief discussion about them anyway. So what about binders? What can you tell by looking at the tubes of paint? The answer is very little. You may sometimes have something written on the back of the tube. You may see something like gum arabic written on the back of the tube, but that's not even a guarantee that that's the only binder used. So binders that you'll commonly find are gum arabic. You can also buy that as a separate medium. I have other videos on that. You may find vegetable glycerin. You may find something called ox gall, but that's worth investigating further because you also get synthetic ox gall now. So just because you see ox gall doesn't mean it's from an animal, although it could be. You may see honey. If you want to know more about the binders your manufacturer is using, do have a look at their website. Obviously, like me, if you're worried about animal ingredients, but it's not something you'll easily find an answer to just by looking at the back of the tubes. You'll nearly always need to visit the manufacturer's website. Now, beyond hue or colour, watercolour paints also have other properties. There are properties of transparency and granulation, and also most importantly of permanence. Only one of those is usually mentioned on the paint tube, but we're going to talk about them all right now. So let's talk about the properties of the paint. So we've got permanency, we've got transparency, and we've got granulation. Now, the only one of these that you'll very often find on the tube is the permanency rating. Occasionally you'll find a transparency rating. Very rarely will you find anything about granulation. So let's look at the one that concerns people most, and that's the permanency rating. You'll sometimes see the letters ASTM. I believe it's American Standard Testing Materials. This is simply a testing standards body that certain manufacturers may belong to. It's certainly not the only one used in the world. You may see other ones, and there's often a difference from manufacturer to manufacturer on what they use to indicate permanency. Some may use A ratings like A, AA. Some may use plus signs, usually 1 to 3. Some may use the ASTM standard. Some may use numbers 1 to 3. And some may use an asterisk system. You can see 3 asterisks here on this tube of paint. Here on Daniel Smith, I've got an ASTM rating. The short answer again is you need to look at each manufacturer's website to see how they rate permanency. Colours that fade are called fugitive colours. If you want to do your own test, what you can do is paint your colours onto a strip of paper, paint them in stripes, and then cut that piece of paper into 2. Put one half of it in a drawer, hang the other in a sunny window, and see what happens over time. You also have to consider how much permanency matters to you. If you're an illustrator and you're making book covers and they're going to be reproduced by a computer, then perhaps permanency is not important to you. If you're going to sell fine art paintings or you want to pass things on to your grandchildren, then perhaps permanency is very important to you. It's really something that you need to investigate and decide for yourself. Let's talk now about transparency. Sometimes manufacturers will give a transparency rating or do transparency tests. Transparency is very much affected by pigment type. Naples yellow, for example, is nearly always quite opaque, and phthalo blue is always very transparent. You'll get to know these as you go along. The easiest way is to do a swatch, and the way to test for transparency is to draw a thick black line in a permanent marker pen, paint your swatch across, let it dry and see if that black line becomes cloudy or if it's still razor sharp. This will tell you how opaque your paint is. There's a common misconception that only very highly transparent paints are worth having. This is simply not true. Opaque paints can be very beautiful too. The earliest watercolorists often use them. Finally, granulation. Granulation again is something that is all about pigment type and very little about manufacturer. Ultramarine blue, for example, always granulates heavily. Quinacridone rose is always transparent. Again, you'll just get to know these as you become a more experienced artist, but the best way to see it quickly is just to make some small swatches. It'll pretty soon become clear what sort of paint you have and how much it granulates. Some people hate granulation, some people love granulation. I suggest that you own some in a range that also has some transparent colours. Let's talk now about environmental concerns, also ethical concerns, things like animal ingredients. You will have to do a lot more research about these things if that's something that is important to you. So what I'm going to do here is more sort of put the framework down of the things that you need to consider when you are researching your paint pigments. So let's talk now about those concerns. Let's talk about ethical and environmental concerns. Again, this video is probably already far too long. I can only cover this subject briefly, but I'm just going to give you some things that you might want to investigate further and to think about. Now, you may be alarmed sometimes to pick up a tube of paint and see a warning symbol on the back, and it may say something like this pigment has been proven to cause cancer or something like that. What you have to understand is that every single country has different labeling protocols. When it comes to America, states have actually quite a lot of power, and so an individual state is almost like a small country. It may have its own labeling laws, and therefore you may find that a pigment that's produced in California has to have a warning label, whereas if that same pigment is produced in Texas, it doesn't need a warning label at all. So take these things with a pinch of salt and remember that, if you inject a large amount of any substance into a rat, it's likely to cause cancer. I would prefer that they just left the rats alone. So warning labels don't necessarily mean anything by themselves. You may be concerned about animal ingredients. You may wish to avoid animal ingredients. The main ones you're going to find are in the binders. Most pigments nowadays are vegan. The main exception to that is PBK9, which is a black pigment known as ivory black or bone black. It's literally made from charred animal bones. Again, if this is something that worries you, do your research. What about the environmental problems with paints such as these? Now, we don't have the plastic issue that we have with acrylic paints, but there may be some toxicity to your paints, and you have to think about this on many levels. So first of all, you have to think about the extraction of minerals. Do they cause damage to the local environment? Are they exploiting local people, or are the local people that work on preparing those pigments in danger? Does it affect their health? We have to consider the shipping of products, how far they're traveling to you, and how they're packed, of course. Do they come in a load of plastic? You have to consider the toxicity of the pigments themselves. I can't tell you how many classes I've taught where I've seen people sort of put their paintbrush in their mouth and things like that. It's not safe to do so. If you stick your paintbrush by accident in your cup of tea, throw the tea away. Some of the pigments are made from minerals that can be toxic, including versions of lead. The last thing you have to consider is how the pigments are being disposed of and the effect on the water system. One thing I will say to you is that the most environmentally friendly product that you have is the one you already own. If you own a paint that you find to be toxic, if you own a brush that you discover to be real animal fur and you had no idea, it doesn't do anyone any good to throw it in the bin. If, like me, you're a vegan and you find that your Payne's Grey has got some bone black in, just use it up. Throwing it in the bin is not going to save any animals in retrospect. If you find all of this information about environmental damage really, really difficult to get your head around, then what I suggest you do is, as your colours run out, if you run out of one particular colour, say it's a cadmium red, and the cadmiums don't always have the best reputation, you could spend a little bit of time researching that particular pigment and seeing if there's a more environmentally friendly replacement. The same when it comes to your brushes, just use up what you've got, and we can all try to do better with our future purchases. So do let me know in the comments what you found most useful about this video. If there are any areas that you would like me to expand on further, as I said, it's a vast subject. You'll also want to probably have a look at my colour mixing playlist. It's going to give you a lot more information about colours. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. There's lots of free stuff down there for you, including some free downloadable PDF guides. There's even a free watercolour painting course that you can take for zero money whatsoever. If you've enjoyed this video, do have a look at another one of my colour mixing videos. You can watch that one right now.